Hey, this is Chris, and in this video I'm going to be talking about where property prices are headed in Australia. So first of all, I need to put it out there that property prices are notoriously hard to predict, just like all other asset prices. Not only are property prices impacted by fundamentals, which I'm going to be talking about in a second, but also the emotions and the expectations of the people buying them. And those emotions and expectations can change very quickly and go from one extreme to another. And really, that's one of the main drivers of property prices. And unless you're able to predict the expectations of everyone, it's very hard to know exactly where they're headed in the short term. However, there are a few big factors driving property prices at the moment, and this video is going to focus on those factors. I'm going to be talking about 4 factors that are positively impacting property prices in Australia and 4 big factors that are negatively impacting property prices in Australia. So starting off on the positives. So the first one is interest rates. Now interest rates have been falling for a long time, for 20 or 30 years in Australia now, and are now basically zero. And interest rates being low is positive for property owners for a few reasons. One, it gives you the ability to borrow more money. It allows you to service your debt in a more easy way because your interest rates are quite low on your interest repayments. But also, interest rates drive what sort of return you can earn from other assets. And so at the moment, there's not a lot of return you can earn from leaving your money in the bank or putting it into term deposits. And so low interest rates actually forces people into other investments that at least earn some sort of return. And property earns a rental return, and so it's an asset that is attractive when interest rates are very low. So interest rates is one. The next one is lending standards. So a few years ago in Australia, the banks were basically forced to tighten up the lending standards, which essentially made it harder for people to borrow to buy property. Now recently, the banks have been instructed that they are able to loosen those standards again, which will make it easier for people to access the capital they need to buy property. So this is ultimately a positive that will make it easier for people to buy properties. The next factor positively impacting property is the interest holidays a lot of the banks have been giving at the moment. So obviously with COVID affecting a lot of people's employment and ability to make repayments on their mortgages, a lot of people have actually been unable to pay down their mortgages. In normal times, that may force them to actually sell their properties, but at the moment, banks have allowed them to just defer paying interest on their mortgages. And this deferral has allowed people to build up their savings. In fact, the savings rate in Australia has increased recently to a high since the 1970s, and that increased savings rate is allowing people to build a bit more of a buffer and allowing them to continue to hold on to their properties, which is ultimately good for property prices. And the last factor positively impacting property is all of the government support we've been getting at the moment. So this year, the government has loaded Australians with an unprecedented level of government aid. Hundreds of billions of dollars have gone into JobKeeper and JobSeeker, which has ultimately allowed people to hold on to their jobs and continue to pay off their mortgages. So at least in the short run, all of that government support is also helping to prop up the property market. However, there's also a few forces really negatively impacting property prices now and in the future. The first one is that in Australia, our borrowing rates or our household debt relative to our incomes is already very high by global standards. And property prices can only really rise due to 2 things. One is wages rising over the long run, which obviously isn't happening at the moment in Australia, or people's borrowing capacity increasing. And because people in Australia are already borrowing a lot relative to the incomes they have, there's really limited ability for our borrowing to increase further. And so that's probably being a bit of a cap on property prices in Australia. The second is migration. So one of the drivers of property prices increasing in Australia historically has been in migration levels. People moving to Australia, setting up new lives, and also foreign investment. With COVID this year, both of those have really come to a halt. And so those 2 supports have fallen away and are negative impacts, at least in the short term, on property prices. The next one is employment. Now, although there's a lot of government support at the moment, unemployment is rising in Australia. There are more people out of jobs, and people who are out of jobs can either not afford to pay down their current mortgages or can't afford to get new mortgages to buy new property. And both of those are negative impacts on the property market. And the final one, which I think is an interesting, more of a long-term philosophical one, is the longer term impact of the current government support. So while the hundreds of billions the government's spending now is good for property in the short run, there are negative implications in the long run, because eventually that money needs to come from somewhere. And it can either come from taxes, and increasing taxes for Australians in the future isn't going to be good for property because they're not going to be able to use that money to buy a property. Or it can come from the government essentially inflating our way out of all of the money they've borrowed from other countries. And inflation is also a negative for property because it leads to higher interest rates, and those higher interest rates make property less attractive as an investment. Now, I'd love to hear any other factors you think that are important in driving property, so please leave comments below. And if you'd like to hear about some of the factors I think you should be considering when you buy a property in Australia, I've got the link for you here, which you can check out as well. If you'd like to see videos that are similar to this, please hit the subscribe button below. I'm posting on this channel twice a week.